Hey everyone, welcome back to Coffee and Crime. So in today's video I'm going to be doing a deep dive into the psychology behind stalking, what goes on in their mindset to create a person to stalk somebody, perhaps how we can stop that from happening ourselves, but also the victims and how this affects them. I'm going to be doing this in two parts. So the first one, I'm going to be talking about stalking in general, bringing up one of the cases at the moment, which is Baby Reindeer, which has been in the news in regards to Richard Gadd and the person who stalked him. Part two, I'm going to also be looking into the person that is accused of stalking and what has gone on for this person and why she is doing what she's perhaps doing. So if this is something that you are interested in and look to the mindset of why criminals do what they do and then the effects of this, what this can have on the victims, then this channel could be for you. So if you've enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed, then please think about doing so because it does help the algorithm. So in the meantime, sit back, relax while we dive into the criminal minds around stalking. So while most stalking happens in regards to it being somebody that generally a person knows, this can be an ex-partner, a friend, work colleague. We see it also happening with celebrities as well. Somebody will feel that they have some deep inner connection with a celebrity and they will find out where they live, they will stalk them, and so this is a more common one that we have seen. So as much as, like I say, some of it can be from people that we know, they also can be from complete strangers. And stalking can go from just the various sort of online comments, etc., where you're following that person online, but as time goes on it can also get more serious. And this can happen to anyone, no matter age, race, culture, no matter what, it can happen to anyone. No one is off limits. Some of the more common stalking behaviours include repeated calls, text messages, email, or even posts via social media. It can then go on to become more of in the physical world, where they're following the person, showing up at their home, work, even school, basically anywhere that the person might frequent. Some of the more extreme can find out very personal information about the victim, but then we're moving into the very serious, where they can even threaten physical harm to the person. So in various countries, stalking is against the law, but also there are some where it isn't taken as seriously. So in America, stalking is defined differently by the different states. So you will have one state which gives it's an actual crime, and then another one will go more lightly on whether or not they take stalking as serious. In the United Kingdom, through the Policing and Crime Act in 2017, the maximum sentences for the most serious harassment and stalking were increased from 5 to 10 years imprisonment. So some of the statistics and facts around stalking: approximately 15% of women and 6% of men are stalked in the United States alone. So that shows you, actually, that's quite a big percentage when you look at it. It says young people are more at risk of being stalked than older people. More than 50% of female stalking victims and more than 30% of male stalking victims were first stalked before they were 25 years old. According to the crime survey for England and Wales, an estimated 1.5 million adults were stalked in the 12 months ending in March 2021. This alarming figure highlights, in my opinion, the prevalence of stalking and its devastating effects on victims' lives. You've only got to look up the word stalking to see how many cases are out there. And some of the cases have been solved, some of them haven't. Some of them have left the survivors of stalking, and then others, unfortunately, have had their lives ended. There was a case which is Anna Nissette from Port Townsend in Washington had a 9-year fight to prosecute her stalker. In 2019, the man who stalked her was finally sentenced to 10 years in prison, granting her what she calls a decade of freedom. And I think that goes to show why I believe a lot of people don't come forward, or if they do come forward, they're just not believed. To fight a case for 9 years against somebody who has, in a way, taken away your basic human rights, has created you to feel a prisoner in your own world, and that's not taken seriously, I think is incredibly sad. In the United Kingdom, Shana Grice, I think her name is, was a British teenager who was murdered by an ex-partner after he stalked her. The murder led to the criticism of Sussex police, which is where I live in Sussex. They were criticised for their failure to take Grice's complaint seriously. And again, this is so common. We see this more often than not, which is going to lead me to one of the most famous cases that we're seeing at the moment, which is where a Netflix series was done in something called Baby Reindeer, which is a case of stalking. And in that, it's about this man, Richard Gadd, who was stalked by a woman who at the time said he went to the police to complain and to put in a report in what's going on, and he wasn't taken seriously. So the first anyone had heard of this, I believe, was when Netflix released this, which was back in April this year. The premise of the story is surrounding somebody called Donnie, who is played by Richard Gadd, and this is his story. So he plays, in effect, he plays himself. So he says this is based on some deeply traumatic events that happened in his life, where he was stalked by somebody that he's named as Martha. And I will talk about the person who has come out since then. Her name is Fiona. I'm going to talk about her in another video. So in this, he talks about being stalked by this woman and then essayed by another person. And he goes into quite graphic detail. I don't know if any of you have watched Baby Reindeer. I watched most of it. There was one episode I missed out because it was quite graphic and I didn't want to watch it. But it's quite eye-opening, I will say. It's also important to say that at this point, the story is under investigation by some people, because the woman who's come out, who says that she is the woman that they're talking about, the stalker, she has now begun a lawsuit against Netflix for defamation, I believe. She says that Gadd's version in Netflix is filled with a lot of inaccuracies, one of them being that she went to prison for stalking, where she states that never happened. So like I said, so Baby Reindeer is basically the real life story of Richard Gadd. Gadd said that he first met Martha, who he names, that's the stalker's name. He first met her when he was working in a pub, and he basically, the sort of story goes where she sort of come in, she sits down, she doesn't really have any money, so he feels quite sorry for her, and he strikes up a conversation, and he gives her a cup of tea on the house, which is what he's saying started the whole thing off.
And its story begins when Danny, out of kindness, while working at a bar, offers a cup of tea to a woman who appears sad and upset. However, this act leads to the destruction of Danny's life, as the woman, named Martha, turns into a crazed stalker of his life.
A little bit about Richard. In the series, he claims to be a comedian, a struggling comedian, trying to make it into the industry, and he was finding it very difficult. And I think that that's important to note, because I feel it does explain a little bit of why, to some degree, this stalking was enabled. Because at the end of the day, you're going by what this Netflix series is showing. Now, bearing in mind, it does state at the beginning, this is a true story. So when you're watching it, you're leading to believe that what you're watching and witnessing actually happened, with a little bit of creative license. So you see this sort of friendship developing, where Martha is coming in every day. She's kind of talking about she's busy and she's this, but she ends up sort of staying there every day, all day, talking to him. And Richard sort of goes on to say that, you know, he felt very sorry for her. He humoured her a lot of the time, but he also enjoyed her company. So he says that in the beginning, he sort of developed this friendship with her, and he sort of started to enjoy her company. Now, Martha is played by an actress, Jessica Cunning, who I feel actually played the role very, very well. She was very believable. So Gadd goes on to say that over the course of 3 years, he received 41,000 emails from his stalker, 350 hours worth of voicemail, multiple social media messages, and 106 pages of letters. And that's not including the texts that were sent allegedly by her. So he also goes on to say that she turned up at his shows when he was, so he started seeing her out and about where he was, none of which at the time was punishable by law, because in all effect she wasn't doing anything or saying anything that was threatening or anything that was wrong. It was just a lot. He goes on to say that there were times when it was so debilitating, it was draining, debilitating. And I think it's important to note that when you're watching this happen on Netflix, or when you're watching a Netflix series that's based on this true story, there were times when I'm watching this and I'm thinking, but he does encourage her. Now, I'm not saying that doesn't happen, because it does. Empathy is one of the biggest things, and I think one of the most common factors within stalking is at certain points you can feel empathy for the person who's stalking you, especially in the beginning. And I think that was definitely what was happening. And then when you have somebody who's starved of that attention, affection even, that's what I believe Martha, the character's name, latched onto. So she got this level of kindness from Richard at the time, and there's always a trade-off. So when something is happening, there's an investment. And so I think that with Martha, the investment was that she found somebody who seemed to accept her for who she was, who seemed to joke and find her funny, at times even sort of be a bit flirtatious with her. And this created her to form this fantasy in her mind of where this relationship was going. Now, you then look at the other side and you sort of see that you've got somebody like Richard who is trying to make it in the industry, and then all of a sudden you've got what looks to be like this fan, somebody who idolizes you, and that can be quite seductive for some people, especially if you're trying to break it into the industry, you're trying to get people to notice you, and then suddenly this person comes along who's coming to your shows, who's being supportive, who's telling you how great you are, who's wanting to spend time with you and almost lifting you up. I think, again, for someone like Richard, that was also intoxicating. And I think in the beginning, he encouraged it, enabled her in some way, not obviously realizing that the full extent of what was going to happen, which I think, a lot of us, if you're a kind person, you can see how this could develop. So when Gad spoke about his motivation for writing this story, what had happened to him, I feel that he sort of said a lot of that was because it's not very well known that men get stalked. It's when we hear about stalking, we think of women being stalked by men. And I think that he wanted to talk about his experience of what had happened to him. And I think to some degree, when you've gone through something like that, you're wanting to take your power back. And I feel that is an element of what he wanted. This had gone on for so long that he wanted to reclaim some element of his power back to his life. Certainly when I've worked with people that have gone through something like being SA'd, or they're a victim of something of some level of abuse, the one thing that is the common denominator is your lack of power. You feel helpless, and there's a sense of shame within that, and especially, unfortunately, around men. And especially if the perpetrator is a woman, he wasn't believed when he went to the police. They kind of almost laughed it off as if it wasn't, what you're being, stalked by a woman. It's almost like this common belief that he almost like that should be, there's nothing wrong with that. But to someone like Richard, who this was starting to have a real knock-on effect in his personal life, because he got so far entrenched with her that I think that which you can see in the Netflix series, that there sort of come a point when you'd crossed over a line. So there's a moment when you know that something isn't right, and he states this, you know, throughout the series. There were moments in the beginning that he knew that he should have shut this down. He knew that he should have done something, but it was almost like he felt so sorry for her that he didn't want to, you know, to tell her to stop coming. And I think that, like I say, there was a part of him that actually liked it as well, because he even admits that when at some point when he did stop her, he then sought her out. He actually missed seeing her. So then there almost becomes this very sort of dysfunctional, toxic sort of relationship developing between stalker and victim. And I think that that was definitely happening between the two of them. So of course then it starts up again. But I can understand from his perspective why that developed. And I can also, in some ways, understand for someone like Martha why she enjoyed the attention that she got from Richard, and she felt that that was real, that there was something more than what there was. I think when you listen to the story, that I mean, I've certainly seen a lot of this written online, is one of the biggest things is Richard's ability to have empathy for his stalker. And when you're watching it from the outside, you can quite easily get caught up in the, I wouldn't feel sorry for this person's crazy, or this person is this, that and the other. But you don't necessarily know what it feels like when you are somebody that's also broken. And I think that there was an element of Richard that was also broken when this was happening. So he got something from Martha, and Martha also got something from him too. So it enabled him to sort of see something in her that was about himself even, which unfortunately then gave the empathy, which then unfortunately encouraged the behaviour, which then set the path to what we have now. You know, I think it's very difficult to understand how you can have empathy for somebody that does, and I think anyone that's been a victim of stalking would be very hard pushed to sort of say, you know, I've got empathy for my stalker, but it does happen. And it can happen. I mean, we see it often, like with captors. If somebody takes somebody against their will, after a long length of time, that person actually can build up a relationship, and it's part of survival. You know, I think that there's an element where I think with it, like even with Richard's case, he becomes scared of what could potentially happen. So you get caught in this trap of I want it to stop, but I'm actually scared that will it get worse if I stop this, if I shut this down. And so a lot of the time you let things go until you end up in a place where you're almost pushed into a corner where you're like, this is too much now, I have to make this stop now. And by that point it's gone too far. You know, when you even look back to, there was a film, I think it was called What About Bob? Yeah, I think it was called What About Bob. It had was it Bill Murray, and I think it was around 1991, I believe. You know, where we saw this psychiatrist who was stalked by the character that was Bill Murray. But it was a comedy, and it was funny, and people, I mean, I watched it myself and I found it, you know, pretty amusing. I mean, being a psychotherapist myself, you know, I found it funny. But actually, when you break it down, there isn't really anything funny about stalking. And unfortunately, what can happen is when we see these type of movies, when we, like even things like Baby Reindeer, when it's done in a way that, you know, there were moments when I actually found Martha's character quite endearing. And I think that that's the danger sometimes, is that we're creating this persona of somebody to either be funny or, you know, so it's quirky and it's not that serious. And unfortunately, this can then play out in the real world, which is what we see happen more often than not with some of the serious cases that I've mentioned, where somebody will go to the police and say, I'm being stalked, and they won't believe you. You know, especially a lot of the time is if you know, you don't have a lot of credible evidence. It's just that you sort of, like, you might see them, but you're not quick enough to take a photograph, so it's plausible deniability. But you get this sense of unease, this, you know, someone's watching you, you know, someone's there, or they're stalking you via email, or they're stalking you via your social media, but they're not saying anything that's deemed really that much of a threat. But actually they're doing it so much that you shut one avenue down and then they come through in another way. Because of course in social media we can say, well, just block them, phone call, block them. But when someone, I think what people don't understand is when somebody is stalking, a lot of the time it's the act of separation when you cut them off that then can create the escalation in behaviour. A lot of the time, and this is where I feel that probably Richard Gadd was when it's just when you're appeasing them and you're doing kind of what they want, it sort of stays on a safer level. You feel that you can manage it to some degree, and you become scared, and that's why you're in this loop of, I want to shut it down, but I'm actually scared to do that. Because unfortunately, when you shut off the avenue of communication, because it's very different to somebody who has narcissism, or you're dealt where actually going no contact is one of the best things to do to somebody like a narcissist, because your contact is the fuel for them, so to speak. Somebody that's a stalker, you're looking at an element where there's something mentally wrong with them. And so when you're dealing with somebody that has got those issues, when you cut off contact, it can create a level of hysteria. And that is when behavior can escalate. That's when they will go from, say, just following you and commenting online to finding out where you live, or if it's just being like you're outside where they live, and then you start ignoring them, where you perhaps were just saying hello to them or whatever it is, then they will then come to your house or come to your place of work or turn up to other areas. They will keep going and going. And so that's why you're in this very terrified loop of what to do that's the best thing to do. The only thing there really is, in a way, is to nip it in the bud in the beginning for most people, before the sort of obsession sets in. And unfortunately, the problem with that is that you don't know when that beginning is really, because at the beginning you don't know this person is going to be a stalker. That's the whole point of it. So when somebody comes in, like in this particular case, where she sits down, you're not going to think twice about being kind to somebody and offering, and you're certainly not going to think that by offering them a cup of tea, it's going to set this ball in motion. So yes, of course, there were moments when there were some things that were said and done that perhaps he could have stopped, and maybe that would have stopped it. Who knows? But there was also the element of him where he did stop it, he did shut it down, and she went, and then he tracked her down. In a way, the stalked becoming the stalker. And that can happen as well. As a psychotherapist, I can understand how and why this potentially happened. It's easy on the outside looking in to show something and say, yeah, there was these pinnacle moments when if that had got shut down, perhaps it wouldn't have escalated to where it has now. But like I say, the problem is if you're in it, you don't necessarily see it. Like I've spoken before about narcissism. You don't, when a narcissist comes into your orbit, because of how generally charming they are, how much of a master manipulator they are, it is sometimes very difficult to pinpoint a narcissist until it's gone too far. And there have been so many people that have been fooled by somebody. Evolutionary theory, as man, we're capable of violence. There are certain circumstances where we might sit here, I can say the same thing, that I absolutely hate violence and I would never be violent. But actually, if push comes to shove, if your life is on the line, or if one of your loved ones is life is on the line, would you commit violence? The chances are, yes, you might. Not willingly so, but you would. There are certain points where we would actually behave in certain ways that we wouldn't deem necessarily that we would do in every other aspect of our normal life. Animals, in a sense, are no different. If an animal feels threatened, they will hunt and they will commit violence. They also do that in a way for food. They are hungry, so they want food. They will do what they do. That is and we accept that because that is how the world goes round. But the difference between obviously us and animals is that we have the ability to think, to second guess ourselves, to understand whether that is right, that is wrong. We're not necessarily always going on base instinct. Whereas unfortunately, when you've got people that have psychopathy, sociopathy, a lot of those things that create us to think, to have empathy, is missing, because that's in your core frontal lobe. The ability to have emotions, to understand emotions. If that's missing, then those core instincts that you have to do those things is going to be there, and you're not going to have the empathy to go, oh, I shouldn't do that. There's been a lot of misconceptions around stalking, with most assuming that stalking is very similar to serial killers. So when you think of a word, stalker, you might automatically conjure up the serial killer that hunts down their prey and singles a person out, or is an opportunist and decides to instinctively do something in the moment. And we see it in films, we see it in TV series, and that's why when it happens to normal, common, everyday folk like you and I, it can actually take a while to register that that is what is happening, that we are being stalked. And that is a lot to do with our preconceived notion of what stalking is. When someone comes in, like in the case of Richard Gadd and Martha, when she's friendly and she's chatting and she's laughing and she's saying all these great things, your immediate instinct is not going to go to, she's a stalker. And that, unfortunately, is why a lot of the times the police do not take this seriously until it's too late. One of the biggest aspects behind the driving force around stalking is, strangely enough, like I've said before, empathy and compassion. And these, which is what Richard Gadd found out, can form a double-edged sword. In the world, we are led to believe that kindness, empathy, compassion, love trumps everything. And it should. And it does to some degree. And there's that very famous saying, no good deed goes unpunished. And that's because at times, like in Richard Gadd's case and in other cases of stalking, your empathy and compassion can work against you. So what is empathy? Well, quite simply, empathy is when you have the capacity to imagine and understand emotions being experienced by what is going on in someone's life. It generally works through the activity of mirror neurons. When you heard the term mirroring, it's a very similar concept. I mean, I use this a lot in my work. When I'm sitting across from a client, I can mirror a client's behavior and movement because it forms a sense of safety. The person feeling opposite feels a sense of comfort because it feels like I'm in alignment with them. And this can happen, and you might find that you'll notice yourself doing this. Something similar is like when someone yawns and then we yawn. When you're watching somebody else move, you might find that you'll start mirroring their movements. And a lot of couples do this, a lot of really good friends do this with each other, and you don't even realize you're doing it because it's firing off those mirror neurons. It's kind of like as if you're in sync with somebody. Whether it's through behavior, facial expression, tone of voice, you'll act in a way that's similar. Like I said, a lot of therapists will use this within a therapeutic framework to create that relational depth, as we call it, to feel as if you are walking alongside your client, you're understanding your client's frame of reference. A person's capacity for empathy is based around how the attachment relationship develops with another person, or in my case, a client. So what happens with stalkers is they have severe attachment disorder. So in a way, it creates them to be desperate in seeking that attachment from somebody else. Like in Richard Gadd's case, him offering her, in his eyes, just a simple cup of tea was such a big statement for Martha that it fired off something within her that created this almost attachment to him. Think of it alongside sometimes what we call trauma bonding, so where two people can form a bond together through something. And in a way, that is kind of what happened with Gadd and Martha, because there's an element of him on his subconscious that was seeking something from someone, and she suddenly fulfilled that. And unfortunately, this can then inadvertently create the stalker victim relationship. So like I've said, stalking is characterized by where you're wanting to develop a closeness and an intimacy with that person against their wishes. It doesn't matter what they want or they say, the person who's a stalker isn't going to hear it, because in their mind they think they know you so well that they know what you want and need above what you want and need, that they will start to form that attachment, but they'll start doing it in certain ways to see how they're received. But most of the time the stalker doesn't hear no. So if it goes past a point, like with Richard Gadd, or Donnie's character, you can see that there were times when he was just being friendly to her. And unfortunately, what he doesn't realize is just the act of being friendly to somebody like Martha is everything. Whereas to you and I, when we're looking and someone's being friendly, it's kind of like, that's nice, but we're not reading anything else into that. Whereas somebody like Martha will be imagining and fantasizing of what that relationship is going to be. In her mind, she's getting married, they're going to have children. You know, you can kind of see that this is developing in her mind into something else. And this is when they can start recreating this fantasy and believing that what is happening is very, very real. Even if you are not necessarily encouraging it any further, it doesn't matter. Once they've hit that point where that fantasy is starting to become reality in their head, it goes past that point of no return. If there's something within you that is craving that attention as well, like in my opinion, I think with Richard Gadd, I think that he'd been rejected and rejected and rejected so often that when he suddenly almost got this, like the equivalent of a super fan, he loved it. And he obviously not realizing that it was going to develop into anything else, but at the time he thrived on it and he encouraged it. But I can understand that there were certain points when he sort of thought, you know, I don't want to seem rude, I this is getting a bit too much now, but not knowing how to shut it down. You know, the other thing as well is to point out that people who become stalkers also tend to suffer from social incompetence. They usually tend to be quite isolated, which kind of makes me feel a bit strange considering I'm quite an introverted person, because that'll be the other thing as well. They'll tend to be quite introverted. There will be loneliness as well, whereas I suppose that is the other difference is myself, even though I'm quite an introverted person and I work from home and I don't tend to socialize an awful lot, I'm not lonely. So I think that is obvious. So I'm not at any risk of becoming a stalker, so that's a relief. So I think, like I say in the beginning, stalking can be seen as harmless, and the terrible consequences of how stalking can develop and what can happen are greatly underestimated. Stalking can affect 1/5 of women and an unknown number of men, and the end result could be the worst case scenario. And it's a shame, in my opinion, that these cases are not taken more seriously. I feel that when somebody feels threatened, when somebody feels that something is happening within their life, that should be taken seriously, because okay, some might pan out to be nothing, but surely it's better to have that affirmed than to ignore it and do nothing, and then the worst case scenario happens, which is what we've seen in a lot of cases. The other sad thing is that most cases of men who are stalked by women do not even go reported because of the shame that comes attached to reporting that kind of case. When a man has been SA'd, that also doesn't get reported because of the shame attached to it. And I find that so disheartening, because anyone, no matter who they are, that has gone through something, no matter who it's against, if you've gone through something that creates that level of trauma, when you've gone through something that violates who you are as a human being, that should be taken seriously, no matter what. You know, stalking has been around for years, absolutely years. And thankfully, albeit a little too late in some cases, it is now becoming more serious and being brought to the forefront more than it ever did before. And when you're watching it, you know, series like Baby Reindeer, that can only but help bring to the forefront how serious this can also affect men as well as women. It's now becoming noticed in many, many areas across the world as a crime. Stalkers are criminals. You know, that no matter how you dress it up, dress it down, the black and white fact is they are criminals. It is wrong to do what they're doing. It is wrong to commit harm to another human being, regardless of what form you might do that in. And unfortunately, it is a simple truth that is often ignored or not understood by the medical profession, mental health clinicians, law enforcement, and the media around the world. So like I say, so thankfully now the law does seem to be catching up, albeit a little too late for some other people that have been the victims of stalking. And if you feel that you are at risk of being stalked by somebody, if you are scared and worried, then please do reach out. There are helplines which I will put in the description box below. You are not alone, so don't feel that you've got to go through something like this alone. It is a serious crime and it is to be taken seriously. So please do not sit in silence if you are worried about something along those lines. So if you've made it this far, I just want to say thank you very much for listening to this video. If you've liked this video, then please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed to the channel and would like to do so, then please hit that subscribe button. Like I say, part 2 will be coming, where I do talk about Fiona, who is the lady that has come out and said that the Netflix series was based around her as the stalker. So I'm going to be doing into a little bit of a dive into her and why she has done what she's done, and the fact that she is now coming out with a lawsuit against Netflix. So yeah, so make sure, like I say, you've subscribed so so make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss that one. If you want to treat me to a cuppa because you want to support what I do here and you have enjoyed this, then the link is in the description box below. There is also a PO box there if you would like to write to me. There is also a Facebook group that has now been started, which is the Coffee and Crime Community. So I'll also put that link in the description box so you can go across and join our Coffee and Crime community and start uploading any true crime things that you would like to talk about, building a community, talking about like-minded things that we're all interested in the realm of true crime. So all the links are in the description box below, so you can literally go on there and you will see the other channels that I have, the other platforms that I'm on. If you want me to discuss a certain topic, then please drop that in the box below, as I will be looking at pretty much everybody. So in the meantime, as always, please stay safe and please stay aware of your surroundings, and I will see you in the next video. Take care. Bye bye.